And while we may not have access to the big picture and be able to see around every corner, how we approach this destiny is in our hands. How we will foster it along. We determine the quality of the journey, though the quantity may not be in our control. We decide whether to feel prosperous or broke, whether to be interested or bored, whether to extend ourselves to other people or feel disenfranchised. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is easy, but I am saying that these are the decisions that each one of us has within our power, and no one makes all of the choices for us but us. So when the unexpected comes up, how do we manage that? Do we decide that must be God pulling some kind of wind out of our sails, or is there another way? I like to share with you a short list of what we can do when life, what's a good, pulls the card. 2 ideas. Number 1, show up. Show up. Number 2, be curious. Be curious. Be in a state of wonder. That childlike, I wonder why this is happening in my life right now. What is the gift that I cannot see at this very second, but is surely on its way to me? Right? Because I'm going to get it. I'm going to get it in a minute or two. You know, we all know heroes, right? I bet if I called any one of us up here to this microphone, you could give us a story and an example of someone in your life who knows how to show up well, right? Show up and be curious. But since we don't have time for everybody to tell a story, I'm going to tell you about a hero that I know. One of my heroes, one who knew about showing up and being curious, and I'm going to call him Larry. I met him a few years ago. He grew up in Northern California. And he had a mom and stepdad, and they bought this little piece of property, and a river ran through it, and they created a campground with some cabins on it, and bought a slew of canoes, and just had a really nice little vacation spot for people coming through California, Northern California. And he worked really hard on it. He'd been through a lot of disappointments in life, a tour of duty in the military, a marriage that didn't work out the way that the participants had hoped, and alcohol is his coping strategy of choice. He was a little bit on the wild side in those days, but he enjoyed running the family business, and then something happened. There was some kind of, I don't know what kind of natural disasters happened in that neck of the woods, but I think there was some kind of storm, flood, wind, and everything got messed up. The configuration of the river got messed up. We know how that is around these parts. And the business went under. They lost canoes. The buildings fell down. I mean, it was kind of not so good. And so left the family in ruins. And somehow in all of that, he became curious. He became curious. And so he began to read and attend seminars about human behavior and human motivation and human activity. And he read up on some of the psychologists of that heyday. One of them was Fritz Perls. He got himself into school with the GI Bill and started working with kids who had a wild streak like his own. He did sober up. And when I met Larry, he spent most of the day reading about health and reading about spirituality. He wasn't a religious guy, but he was very deeply spiritual. And then he would talk to the parade of people that would come into their they lived in a senior development, and there was a, road in front of their house, and people would just show up all the time, people from the neighborhood, because he was kind of one of those people that drew others to him. He was just a lovely person, and now he was happily remarried and living in this park, and he was married to this lovely person, lovely woman who loved to garden, and they ate great food. And so every day, for about 10 minutes, they would take his wheelchair out to the porch where he could sit and listen to the birds, and he could smell those raspberries from that garden, or the flowers, whatever was blooming that time of year, greet the neighbors walking by, and then he'd put his face in the sun for 10 minutes of vitamin D. He was a hero because he figured out a way to deal with misfortune and frustration and conditions of life that weren't on his plan, and yet he was living a life that felt so rich and full. He loved his life, and he loved his life so much that people couldn't stay away from him because he was so full of that life, full of God. You know, he'd suffered. He'd been an alcoholic. He'd gone through a tough divorce and the loss of the business, but he made a choice to show up and to be curious and to grow. And he was infectious. You just wanted to be around him. Some of you may have heard about the author by the name of Pema Chodron. She's a Buddhist nun who runs a retreat center in Canada, and she has written a number of books about showing up, oddly, and being curious. And one of her best-known books is entitled When Things Fall Apart. I want to read to you this quote from her book. There is a common misunderstanding among the human beings who have ever been born on earth that the best way to live is to try to avoid pain and just try to get comfortable. You see this even in insects and animals and birds. All of us are the same. A much more interesting, kind, and joyful approach to life is to begin to develop our curiosity, not caring whether the object of our curiosity is bitter or sweet. To lead to a life that goes beyond pettiness and prejudice and always wanting to make sure that everything turns out on our own terms, to lead a more passionate, full, and delightful life than that, we must realize that we can endure a lot of pain and pleasure for the sake of finding out who we are and what this world is, how we tick and how our world ticks, and how the whole thing just is. If we are committed to comfort at any cost, as soon as we come up against the least edge of pain, we're going to run. We'll never know what's beyond that particular barrier or wall or fearful thing. So in our culture, in our world today, there is much about which we can be curious. I am curious about healthcare. It's just one of those things. I wish and would like to be someone who could affect change about health care. I'm concerned about it, how decisions will be made given all the changes that are occurring in our culture. And a lot of it's beyond my understanding. I'd like to be an agent for change. I'd like to see care extended to the people who have not as well as the people who have. So I'm curious about the decisions that are being made, and maybe you are too, and I'm curious about what role I might be able to play at some point in my life. In the meantime, it is our gift and our ability and our right to show up as completely as we can, to affect change, to bless ourselves and to bless others, not to medicate ourselves against the pain, but to be curious when it shows up in life, and to continue the practice of awareness. So one more story, short one. This is a story about a woman who is running away from tigers. She runs and runs, and the tigers are getting closer and closer, and when she comes to the edge of the cliff, she sees some vines there, so she climbs down and is hanging on to the vines. And looking down, she sees there are tigers below her as well. And then she notices that there's a mouse, and the mouse is chewing away on the vine to which she is clinging, and she also sees a beautiful little bunch of strawberries close to her, growing out of a clump of grass. She's looking at that strawberry. It's really red. It's really sweet looking, really juicy. She can almost see the moisture of that strawberry. You can just feel it in your mouth, can't you? She wants that strawberry. And so she takes it, and she puts it in her mouth, and she enjoys it thoroughly. Tigers above, tigers below. This is actually the predicament that we're always in terms of our birth and death. Each moment is just what it is. It might be the only moment of our life. It might be the only strawberry that we'll ever eat. We could get depressed about it, or we could finally appreciate it and delight in the preciousness of every single moment of our life. Show up, be curious, and delight in every precious and delicious morsel. Amen.